Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So first, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this REL Pacific webinar, An Introduction to Social and Emotional Learning, Navigating Definitions, Frameworks, and Best Practices. My name is Kirsten Miller. I'm a Communications Manager at REL Pacific, and I'll be your facilitator today. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Marisa Crowder, who will be your primary presenter today, and also by Betsy Calloway, who is serving as our technical facilitator. So if you're having any tech issues, please feel free to shoot Betsy a note in that chat box, and we'll do our best to get you squared away and set up. Just a couple of little housekeeping issues that we always start with. If you haven't attended a webinar using Zoom before, it's a little different than a lot of other webinar platforms. Mostly it's less formal than Adobe Connect, for example, or GoToWebinars. So it's easier to run into technical difficulties if people are clicking around on the commands. So we're going to ask you to limit yourself to using the chat box feature. But we do encourage you to use that feature throughout the webinar to ask questions or make observations, and we've set aside quite a bit of time for conversation at the end of the presentation. So first, I'd like to briefly introduce Marisa and tell you a little bit about REL Pacific before we jump into our content. Marisa is a researcher at REL Pacific, and in her role here, she provides insight on the role that non-cognitive factors play in promoting college and career readiness, and provides support on how education researchers and practitioners can foster social and emotional learning factors in their schools. She has 5 years of experience working for the Washoe County School District prior to joining McREL, where she assisted in the implementation and evaluation of their social and emotional learning initiative, and was also a member of a research practitioner partnership with the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL. So they work to develop a student self-reported assessment of their social and emotional competencies. She obtained her BA and her MA in psychology from San Diego State University and her PhD in interdisciplinary social psychology from the University of Nevada at Reno. Next, I'd like to take just a minute to tell you a little bit about REL Pacific and our work in case you're not familiar with us yet. We are one of 10 regional educational laboratories funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, or IES. So on this map that's in front of you right now, you can see all 10 of those regions. In this next slide, you can see the regions that we serve. We serve educators in the state of Hawaii, 3 U.S. territories, which include American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and then 3 independent nations in free association with the U.S. And that includes the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, which is made up of Koshrai, Pohnpei, Chuuk, and Yap, and also the Republic of Palau. So as you can see from this map, our region is quite geographically vast, and in fact it spans an area greater than the entirety of the continental US. So within these jurisdictions, we work with a number of research practice partnerships, and those focus on several distinct priority areas, including college and career readiness and success, where we work to align system expectations for K-12 graduates with entry into college and the workforce. Professional learning, which is all about collaborating with teachers and system leaders to create a professional learning environment in which teacher development is both welcome and is effective. And early learning and early literacy, which focuses on developing language skills and literacy goals in multilingual contexts for early elementary students. Now all of those priority areas are sort of undergirded by Pacific cultures and education. It really underlies all of the support that we provide to education stakeholders in the Pacific, because integration and cultivation of local cultures is central to students' education outcomes and to system improvement efforts. So we have also recently expanded our work into the areas of language policy and social and emotional learning, which is the focus of our time together today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Marisa for our presentation today.
Right. Can you see my screen, Kirsten?
We can.
The interest in SEL?
We can.
Great. All right, so the impetus for this webinar really stemmed from the interest in social emotional learning among our partners in the Pacific. Through conversations that I've had with our partners, they've expressed concern over trauma and uncertainty that their students are facing from climate-related events, such as typhoons and rising waters. There are concerns about elevated rates of depression, suicidal thoughts, and bullying, and just an overall desire to support their students' learning in the classroom. So my goal for this webinar today is to provide an overview of social emotional learning. I've collected as many resources as I can to help education researchers and practitioners navigate through the many definitions, frameworks, and best practices. So my objectives for today are to provide an overview of social emotional learning frameworks, to describe the research that links social emotional learning with positive academic and life outcomes, to outline ways in which educators can promote social emotional learning across various levels of the school system, and to provide insight into some future directions of social emotional learning research and practice. So in other words, where is the field going? So, excuse me. To start our conversation, I'd like to invite the audience of this webinar to use their chat function to just describe what comes to mind when you think of social and emotional learning. And I'll give you all just a minute or two to respond.
So if you're not familiar with Zoom, that chat box should be that little thing that looks a little bit like a thought bubble just at the bottom of your screen. So we have from Roberta, we have the needs for all students to fit into their environment and their peers.
Mm-hmm.
We have another comment, why SEL is so important today. There's another problem solving, responsible decision making, less bullying. Here we go. We're starting to scroll down here. Improving children's social and emotional skills for all students to feel safe in their school and classrooms. The capacity to participate meaningfully in relationships with others and in general in one's environment. Ongoing life learning, school-wide interventions, understanding one's emotions and how to navigate them. Problem solving, responsible decision making, less bullying. And we've got the ability to participate in group activities in school while preserving students' own voices respectfully. Informal and curriculum-based teaching of skills that will help the students interact with others, regulate their emotions, build social skills, and be ready to learn academics.
Mm-hmm.
And helping teachers deal with traumatized students. We have actually a question that we can hold for a little bit later for the conversation, but that question is, how is it different from old self-esteem efforts? And that may be something that Marisa is going to touch on throughout the presentation today.
Definitely, and if not, I invite you to have this conversation at the end if I haven't addressed it. So this was great. So we've listed a lot of different things. I see cultural sensitivity here, student collaboration and building collaboration skills, promoting a sense of belonging, making sure students can manage their emotions. I wanted to begin my conversation with this question just to highlight the fact that this field is so vast, that there are many different terms, many different social and emotional competencies that help students engage in their learning and help them perform better academically that educators are addressing. So if you're not familiar with the field, it can be a little overwhelming if you are approaching it with your specific students' needs in mind, but may come across the many different social emotional competencies that can and practice to promote those competencies as you're attempting to help your students in your own context. So some other terms you may have heard might be character education or promoting life skills so that students develop the kind of values such as respect, justice, and citizenship, those things that help students to become contributing members to society after they graduate. Another common term is growth mindset, or the belief that your intelligence is malleable, that you can improve your knowledge on a subject matter, and that as a result, the effort you put into your classwork will contribute to your learning. This is often contrasted against a fixed mindset, which is the belief that intelligence is not changeable and therefore effort isn't related to learning. And research has shown that when you promote a growth mindset in the classroom, that students engage in the material more and do perform better academically. Another common term is mindfulness, so teaching students to focus on their thoughts and feelings, helping them direct their attention to their internal environment so that they can better navigate through their social and external environments. Research has shown that when we promote mindfulness in the classrooms, students display higher levels of empathy and optimism, lower levels of depression and aggressive behaviors, and they also perform better academically, as has been demonstrated with or through higher math scores. So it's important to note that the focus on supporting students' social emotional needs in the classroom is not new. This has been happening for a very long time as educators recognize that student learning is not just a reflection of their delivery of content knowledge or of content. What students bring to the classroom, their stresses with their peers, maybe stress with their home environment, affects their ability to learn. And social emotional learning practices help teachers support those needs so that students can be engaged and have an overall better sense of well-being. What is new, however, is this explicit focus on social emotional learning within school strategic plans and developing their own standards. And this has been the result of several factors. However, I'll describe just a few, just to give a background on the field of social emotional learning. One of the factors is an acknowledged racial and ethnic inequity in school discipline as a result of zero tolerance policies. So specifying a set of behaviors that leads to an automatic suspension or expulsion. However, what research has shown is that educators were more likely to draw this line for some students over others, and particularly students of color. I show just one source of data on the screen, where if you take our attention to the left-hand column, we see that Black students comprise about 16% of students enrolled in schools in the United States. However, they are overrepresented in suspension rates by about 23%. Conversely, white students, who comprise about half of the student population, are underrepresented by about 18%. In addition, there are concerns about bullying and ineffective anti-bullying policies, which really fail to account for the fact that bullies are coming to school with their own potentially traumatic experiences and their own social emotional needs, and that the aggressive behavior were just manifestations of what the types of things that they were dealing with. So the conversation shifted away to focus on preventative rather than reactive measures to reduce problem behavior. This resulted in several frameworks, including the response to intervention, multi-tiered systems of support, and positive behavioral interventions and support to reinforce positive behaviors rather than discipline negative behaviors. Ultimately, the conversation started to shift into how do we help students develop the types of skills to develop positive relationships and make responsible decisions. In 1994, a group of researchers got together asking this question, and they developed the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, or CASEL. CASEL has been one of the leading proponents of social emotional learning and have developed the CASEL framework, which I'll get into a little bit more detail later on in the webinar, but they also engage in other activities that include lobbying to promote social emotional learning policy at both the state and federal levels, promoting and engaging in research on social emotional learning, and they provide technical assistance to educators as well. And today we could see that social emotional learning is everywhere, and if not, it's definitely a term that is recognized by a lot of educators. This stems in part from the Every Student Succeeds Act, which established more flexible definitions of academic achievement other than academic performance indicators. So they also included indicators that might that point to the whole child. And this has allowed schools to engage in practices that help support the whole child. And some of these practices take the form of social emotional learning. To date, all 50 states have social emotional learning related standards for preschool, and 14 have standards for K through 12. And oftentimes these look like they specify what a certain social emotional competency should look like for younger students versus older students. Given the increased focus on social emotional learning, there has been a tremendous amount of effort among researchers and entrepreneurs around social emotional learning programs. An analysis of 50 programs out of an identified 150 show that there were over 700 unique social emotional learning related terms. Now, again, this just highlights the nature of the field and how it can potentially be overwhelming for educators who are looking for strategies to help their students in their systems with their needs. Social emotional learning efforts have been tied to student academic outcomes. Several meta-analyses have shown that when students are exposed to social emotional learning programs, they have stronger social emotional competencies, more positive attitudes towards themselves and others, and are more likely to engage in pro-social behaviors. It's also been associated with increases in improvements in academic outcomes such as GPA and standardized test scores. And at the same time that social emotional learning has been associated with increases in positive outcomes, it's also been associated with decreases in negative outcomes. So things like conduct problems, substance use, and emotional distress. A longitudinal study has shown that social skills at age 11 predict multiple lifelong outcomes. Students are more likely to graduate and earn a higher degree. By the time these students are adolescents or 16 years old, they are less likely to smoke, be truant from school, be in trouble with the police, and for girls, they're less likely to have become pregnant. By the time they reach their adult years, they are less likely to be in trouble with the police, more likely to be in good physical and mental health, and they also have greater work experience and higher employment status and more stable employment status as well. So these effects are expected to accumulate over the lifespan to have a positive impact on society as well. An analysis has shown that a 1:11 cost-benefit ratio, and what this means is that for every $1 spent on social emotional learning programs, it's been estimated that society receives $11 back. All right, so just gave you a little bit of background on why social emotional learning has become such a focus for schools, but what is social emotional learning? So I pull on the definition proposed by Castle, who state that social emotional learning is the process through which both children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage their emotions, to set and achieve positive goals, to feel and show empathy for others, to establish and maintain positive relationships, and to make responsible decisions. Now, given the many components of social emotional learning, practices can address many different goals. So engaging in students in their social emotional learning can help build empathy, reduce aggressive behaviors, teach conflict resolution, develop compassion and mindfulness, build a sense of community in the classroom or your school, reduce bullying, or teach self-advocacy skills, just to name a few. But as an educator, you might be thinking, well, where should I go to address my students' specific needs? And an important first step is to identify a social emotional learning framework. So a framework organizes and simplifies research theories and ideas in order to facilitate communication around social emotional learning, creativity about practices, and to develop an action plan. The EASL Lab at Harvard University has identified over 130 social emotional learning frameworks, and I invite you to take a look at their resources online to compare frameworks with one another. I'm just going to cover 3 commonly used frameworks in this webinar, but there, as we can see, there are many more. The CASTLE framework is one of the more commonly used frameworks, according to a survey from principals. According to this framework, students' social emotional competencies can be binned into 5 broad categories. Self-awareness refers to accurately identifying one's emotions, thoughts, strengths, and weaknesses. Self-management refers to being successfully regulating one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, as well as setting and working towards important goals. Social awareness refers to empathizing with others, understanding social norms, and respecting diverse opinions. Relationship skills consists of establishing and maintaining positive relationships, and responsible decision-making is the ability to understand the consequences of your behavior and to problem solve. According to this framework, student social emotional competencies are supported within the classroom through direct SEL curriculum and instruction. This is further supported by school-wide practices and policies that promote a positive learning environment and school culture centered on social emotional learning, which is further supported by partnerships with families and communities around social emotional learning. "21st Century Learning" is a framework that was developed by educators, researchers, and business professionals who argued that in order for students to be able to be successful after they graduate from high school, they have to have a certain set of skills to meet the ever-changing demands. And these skills included life and career skills, learning and innovation skills, as well as information and technology skills. And by weaving the teaching of these skills with key content areas, not only helps students master these content areas, but also gets them ready for life after they graduate. The emotional intelligence framework consists of 4 branches. The first is perceiving emotions, so accurately interpreting your own and others' emotions, facilitating thought using emotion, and this might take the form of generating your own emotional reaction to relate to another person and to show empathy. To understand emotions, the third branch, and that includes understanding what gives rise to certain emotions and what the consequences of your emotions are, and then managing those emotions to achieve a desired outcome. And emotional intelligence in the research has been linked to students to positive academic outcomes as well. Blythe and Borofsky have presented a guide on the types of things that educators should consider when choosing a framework. I outline a few of the key questions here, but I am happy to share that resource with those of you who are interested. I present 2 questions together because they are highly related. The first is, what are your students' needs? And you would want to then select a framework that addresses your students' needs. So for example, if you are an educator who wants to reduce bullying in your schools or wants to help your students learn how to set realistic but optimistic goals, you might rely on different frameworks to do so. This can be more complicated the larger you go in your system, as the same system can have different needs. So for example, researchers in Washoe County asked high school students from 2 different schools what they struggled with the most with regards to relationship skills. So 2 different high schools in the same overall social emotional competency domain. Students from one school indicated that they had greater difficulty not responding aggressively to provocation. They said things like, if you pop off at me, I'm going to pop off at you. Students from another school indicated that they had a greater difficulty respecting a difference of opinion or apologizing when they were wrong. These students had a hard time agreeing to disagree. So here we see that even within the same system, even within the same social emotional competency domain, that there are several different needs that educators need to address. Another thing that is important to consider is whether or not the framework is grounded in empirical evidence. In other words, do the competencies that are being described in the framework, have they been shown to be linked to students' academic and behavioral outcomes? Are the practices described shown to have the intended impact of, because the goal here is to address your students' needs and to support them, both their overall well-being and their academic performance as well. Are the competencies addressed in the framework clearly and equitably defined? So in other words, as an educator, what should you look like? What should you look for in your students? How do you know if a student is in need of additional supports, or if they are, if you would consider them being social and emotionally competent? And this could, so just for an example, for self-awareness, this is a multifaceted construct. So you can be self-aware of your own strengths and weaknesses. You can be self-aware of your emotions and the consequences of those emotions. And so having a clear understanding of the various aspects of a construct is important. Depending on your goals as well as an educator or as an administrator, you might want to have you might want to address a larger scope of students. So in this case, you may want a framework that clearly defines the constructs as well as their developmental trajectory. So what should social awareness look like for a kindergartner as opposed to a middle school student or maybe a high school student? Another important consideration is whether or not the framework guides practice. So given what you understand about your students, what can you do to help promote their competencies? And are there resources available to support the implementation and evaluation of your practices? So in other words, can you demonstrate that what you're doing is having an impact? If certain students need some support, are there resources available to do so? So what does social emotional learning look like in practice? Well, the short answer is that it's highly variable. It takes two forms, broadly speaking, which is direct instruction and academic integration. And I'll get into the details of these shortly. But many different people can receive social emotional learning. Traditionally, students receive social emotional learning efforts, but more and more we see teachers and adults being exposed to social emotional learning practices. It can be targeted towards specific individuals or groups, or occur in a more system-wide level for entire classrooms or schools. Traditionally, we see teachers and counselors engaging in social emotional learning, but more and more, again, we see schools, districts, and states adopting social emotional learning initiatives as well. So as I mentioned, there are two ways that teachers can engage in social emotional learning in the classroom. One is direct instruction, and this often takes the form of evidence-based social emotional learning programs. These programs are, they systematically promote students' social emotional competencies. Often they offer training and other implementation support. And since they're evidence-based, they have been shown to have a positive impact on student behavior or academic outcomes. Researchers do warn against using piecemeal approaches when you are using a social emotional program. And there are pros and cons to this. As an educator, you understand your students' needs, and you know what kinds of materials will get them more engaged. However, the warning is that when you do this, you are not implementing the program as it was designed, and then you therefore run the risk that you won't have the intended impact. There are 4 key elements to effective social emotional learning programs that are represented in the acronym SAFE. That is, they are sequenced, connected, and coordinated activities that foster development, social emotional development. They are active forms of learning to help students master those skills and competencies. They are focused and they are explicit in that they target a specific skill. There are many examples of social emotional learning programs that are evidence-based. I just outline a few here. The first is Mind Up, which is a program that promotes mindfulness and that it teaches students to recognize and manage their thoughts and emotions. There are also the 4Rs, which builds empathy and community in students. There's Tribes Learning Community, which builds a sense of community as well. The Ruler develops emotional intelligence, and School Connect develops a Castle 5 in relation to school and work success. For more information on evidence-based social emotional learning programs, I direct your attention to the Castle guides. There are two. One is for preschool and elementary school, and the other is for high school. And these guides outline the various components to social emotional learning programs that are evidence-based. And it's important to note that social emotional learning programs are the most effective when they are implemented system-wide. That is especially true for students who might bounce around from school to school and then therefore experience a disruption in the exposure to the curriculum and their development. They're effective when they have buy-in from staff. Not only does this influence the likelihood that the program is implemented as it was designed, but it also communicates to students the importance of these activities. And again, they're the most effective when they're not implemented in a piecemeal manner. So similar to, or not similar to direct instruction, but the other strategy for social emotional learning is academic integration. And this is a more holistic approach to implementation. This is where we see teachers incorporating social emotional learning practices in with their content delivery. So the goal of this is to promote the learning of both, right? So by engaging students in social emotional learning practices, you're also getting them engaged with the material, and they're learning, they're more likely to learn the material as well. Activities that promote social emotional learning in this way often promote positive learning environment. It promotes a sense of inclusivity, engagement. You can promote autonomous learners and a sense of collaboration. There are many examples of how to engage in social emotional learning across different content areas. I am using examples from high school English language arts in this webinar. So for example, if you want to promote self-awareness in the classroom, you can provide vocabulary words for emotions or feelings. To promote self-management, you may consider having students share how they've persevered through hard times. For social awareness, you can ask students to take the perspective of different characters and in this way building empathy in your students. For relationship skills, you can teach lessons on effective listening and nonverbal behavior. Or for responsible decision making, you can ask students to identify the decision making process of various characters in a story. So thus far, I have primarily talked about social emotional learning in the classroom context. However, more and more we're seeing that education systems are implementing social emotional learning at either district or statewide. For example, the Collaborating Districts Initiative is a partnership of 20 school districts and Castle, whose goal is to systematically implement high quality social emotional learning district-wide. According to their model, there are 3 key factors that to effective system-wide social emotional learning implementation. I've discussed 2 so far. One is the academic integration piece, and the other is explicit instruction, or system-wide explicit instruction, I should say. But the third is promoting a positive culture and climate centered on social emotional learning. And the relationship between social emotional learning and school climate goes both ways. So not only does a positive climate contribute to more effective social emotional learning practices, but when we engage students in social emotional learning, we're also promoting a positive school climate as well. So the theory of action for the Collaborating Districts Initiative, or to provide a brief summary of the theory of action, looks like this. So SEL training and support is provided to central office staff and administrators, who then disseminate this information to schools, faculty, and staff, who then model and teach social emotional learning to their students. And this can take many different forms. You can have SEL teams at each school who partner with their colleagues to promote social emotional learning. You might have a social emotional learning office in the central office. But importantly, there's a pathway of continuous improvement that relies on student voice. So by getting feedback from students on what their needs are, it's communicated back up and contributes to the continuous improvement process of your social emotional learning efforts. So findings from an external report of the Collaborating District Initiative have shown that there is positive increases in school climate and improved behavioral and academic outcomes. There is also a Collaborating States Initiative, which consists of 25 states. And the goal of this initiative is just to build partnerships across states to get feedback or to provide resources on implementing social emotional learning system-wide. Alrighty, so I've given an overview of social emotional learning frameworks and what educators should look for when identifying things that can best suit their students' needs. Now I want to share some conversations that I've heard in Hawaii and in my previous work, as well as what the literature is showing. And this suggests where the field might be headed. There are conversations about promoting family and community engagement and partnerships, equitable views of social emotional learning, adult social emotional learning, and student voice. And these are just a few of the ways in which social emotional learning is expanding as a field. We see examples of districts incorporating models of parent and family engagement. For example, whereas previously we saw this three-factor model for promoting social emotional learning, now we see that the Austin Independent School District has incorporated parent and family engagement with explicit instruction, culture and climate, and integration. Castle's District Resource Center has many resources and tools available for educators seeking these types of partnerships. There are resources for families to support children's social emotional learning at home. There are tools for promoting parent-teacher relationships that center on social emotional learning. And there are steps on how to identify and work with community partners to promote social emotional learning at school. With regards to equity, researchers argue that engaging in social emotional learning promotes equity in school. That is, by focusing on the whole student, schools can set up structures and practices that help them identify the needs of their students. It promotes a positive and safe learning environment. And by engaging in practices that promote the student-teacher relationship, it reduces disproportionality in school discipline. Additionally, transformational social emotional learning can celebrate the strengths of diversity and help students view their differences as assets rather than as deficits. There are also conversations as to whether social emotional learning frameworks themselves are equitable. And this stems from conversations with individuals who are not from non-Western cultural contexts. So, and I pull on research from cultural psychology to illustrate this point. So, for example, research has shown that members of different cultural contexts differ in many social and emotional domains. For example, how the self is defined relative to others can differ. So in collectivistic societies, the self tends to be defined based on relationships with others, whereas in Western societies like the United States, the self is defined as an independent entity. In addition, cultures can differ in the appropriateness of certain emotional reactions, and this also varies by context, but in some cultures, over emotional displays are viewed as impeding upon the experiences of others, whereas in others, like the Western context, emotional displays are viewed as expressions of yourself and who you truly are, and they tend to be more highly valued. Some of our partners, for example, do not feel comfortable sharing positive views of themselves, and this is because it can be seen as bragging. So they're much more comfortable sharing positive views of their group or their family, but it can be frowned upon in some cultures to describe yourself too positively or do so too overtly. And there are some interesting conversations about students or minority students and their ability to navigate through different cultural groups. So that's not something that everyone has been exposed to, but there are some groups of individuals that need to learn how to code switch across various situations, especially within the academic context. So given that information, I want to invite the audience to reflect on our own views of social emotional competence, our own understandings of social emotional learning frameworks. And if you feel comfortable, please use the chat function to think about ways that we might want to tweak our understanding of social emotional competencies given what we know about cultural differences in social and emotional norms. So I'll go ahead and give you all a minute or two to respond.
Marisa, while our participants are thinking that through and responding, we did have a question that came in during a prior part of the presentation around outcomes of SEL and whether they're specific to SEL writ large or to specific types of interventions. For example, like, does mindset impact attendance, or does mindfulness impact GPA? Has the field done any research specifically on which competencies impact which outcomes?
Actually, I haven't seen an analysis of that so far. I know that there are some research projects underway that are looking to see whether or not, for example, self-awareness is more related to attendance than self-management or things like that. I do know that there's plenty of research out there on certain programs or mindfulness practices that have looked at specific outcomes specifically within their studies. I don't know them off the top of my head right now, but I'm happy to get back to the participant with more information later. I feel like there was another part of that I wanted to say, but I'm not remembering right now. So the data that I presented, however, was meta-analyses from many different social emotional learning programs. So that was not drilled down to specific competencies.
Great, thanks, Marisa. I did take down the participants' names, so we'll follow up after the webinar with some more specific information then on that. We'll see what we can find. We have a comment from Roberta that it was good that you included the cultural differences since the Western behaviors do not always fit into the local cultures.
Yeah, thank you, Roberta. I wanted to kind of think about ways in which certain social emotional competencies can be restructured, understanding different cultural contexts. So for example, when the self is defined in close relation to others, how might we differentiate between self and social awareness, or for cultures where emotional expression may not be as expected, what would self-management of emotion look like, or self-awareness of emotion, or in cultures where listing your strengths is frowned upon, how might we redefine self-awareness, or for students who need to navigate through different cultural contexts or different groups, how can we wrap that into our definitions of social awareness? So that was just some thoughts that I had, and I wanted to see if the audience had some other ideas as well.
So we have another question also from Roberta. Marisa, are you aware of any research or studies on the discipline differences in Hawaii and Guam schools? We talked a little bit earlier about how the Black population is over-identified for discipline issues, et cetera. Are there studies where that would be true for Pacific Islander populations, for example?
I have not seen any. I know that this is an ongoing conversation among educators in Hawaii and Guam, but I can definitely look into it. But I have not personally seen any studies on disproportionality in discipline for Hawaii and Guam.
Other comments, other questions, reflections on this graphic that's in front of us now? We have a couple more coming in. There's one comment: it would seem that ESL students and their classrooms would be a good place to see these cultural issues surfacing.
Yes, and I had this conversation with a colleague of mine who, we were having, especially with regards to family and community partnerships, that there are certain cultures that are more likely to defer to the teacher, for example, but who, when you engage them, are more likely to be engaged in their school, just given the importance of family and community in certain cultural contexts. I have not seen any research, and I've looked on how some frameworks can be tailored for these types of populations, but again, this is ongoing conversations in the field.
Okay, thank you. So we have another comment from Lisa. I would think that including families within SEL programs is a great way to be more aware of cultural differences.
Definitely, I agree. I was just sitting in a talk about family engagement and how doing so can open educators' eyes to some of the things that that families are facing, and so it's not always just cultural. Sometimes it's just being aware of the student's context and supporting the family as well.
So we have another comment from Roberta. How do we teach parents the levels? Would the REL Toolkit Iceberg activity be valuable for this to provide insight into culture? For those of you who are not familiar with that activity, the idea is that cultural differences are sort of like looking at an iceberg. The things that we see above the surface are things that are maybe a little more obvious, things like dress and foods and so forth. But there are a number of things below the surface relative to collectivism or individualism, relative to deference to elders, for example, that we don't always see just right on first glance. So that's a really good question, whether those kinds of activities would be useful.
I mean, I would agree that that would be a valuable tool to start the conversation, because a lot of times when we say things like culture, it doesn't always grab people, or they don't really understand, and so that would be a great tool to use to engage in those types of conversations. I'm not sure what you mean by teach parents the levels. So what do you mean by levels?
Just monitoring the chat box here to see the ones on the screen, the social and emotional competencies listed on the screen. So self-awareness, for example, or
okay.
Or are we talking about the practices and policies? I think we're looking at the competencies, the self-awareness, social awareness, relationship skills, etc.
Mm-hmm. So there are different self-awareness. So there are several tools that you can use that the CASEL does provide for parents. For example, you may want to help parents teach their students social emotional learning. You might teach them how to read to their students to connect with the characters. What might the character be thinking, or what led the character to engage in this type of activity, things like that, and roping in self-management, responsible decision-making, and things like that.
So it sounds like that's a theme relative to a couple of comments that we've received around teaching parents about these competencies and sort of getting parental support to teach their children these competencies and to move them forward in those. Are there any kinds of frameworks or any kinds of specific tools that really do speak specifically to how to involve parents in sort of fostering their students' social and emotional competencies, or has the field not quite gotten there yet?
I see tools emerging, but I have not seen any frameworks that explicitly speak to what parents can do at home. There are some out-of-school program active resources as well, but that is, I think, an emerging field.
There's another question from Belinda. How would you teach impulse control in younger students?
So this can be done in many different ways. This is often done through mindfulness practices in the classroom. Teachers have attested to, like if you were to open the day with a mindfulness activity, they see a reduction in student behavioral issues. There's also some practices, I think it's flip the lid, when you teach students about the different components of the brain and how it relates to emotion control, and you get students to communicate about their negative feelings or what might get them to act aggressively, for example, and by helping them develop the emotion language, it helps them also recognize what's going on internally. So there are a lot of different resources to help impulse control in younger students, and I would am happy to follow up with exactly what specific social emotional learning programs there are, but Mind Up is one of them, and there are several others too. And to address Roberta's question, yeah, so I can see the chat, but you can go ahead, Kirsten.
So Roberta did mention that some schools have used meditation and Tai Chi or breathing activities to work with students. And just from a personal perspective, a teacher friend of mine uses yoga with her kids. She teaches 3rd grade, and she's seen, it's anecdotal, but she has seen really some big changes in behavior since she started doing that.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think from what I'm seeing here in the chat, it does look like there's certainly some emerging areas that people are really interested in that there's not been a lot of research on yet. So there's a lot of room for growth in the field.
Definitely, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this in this talk, is just to demonstrate where the field is going, but to acknowledge that there's not the amount of research that there is compared to some of the other practices as well. So this is great. Shall I move on?
I think we can move on, and then shortly we'll have some time for more questions and discussion. So if anything else comes up, please hold on to that thought, and we'll have some more time to have some conversation in just a few more minutes.
Great, thanks. So to wrap up this section, I just wanted to note that the frameworks identify broad categories of social emotional competencies, that they are not exhaustive lists, and that practices should really be tailored to meet local needs, to take into account cultural differences. And this does highlight that tension between the limited research based on social emotional learning in non-Western cultures, and being able to address the needs of their student. That's not to say that their research isn't out there. There are some examples of social emotional learning programs in other countries. However, they do look very similar to the Castle framework. And again, there's not much research on best practices or things like that around those frameworks. And more we're seeing that just as social emotional learning is important for students, it is also important for adults as well. I see these conversations among educators who have adopted a program system-wide, and then their teachers are in implementing this program are having to reflect on their own social emotional competencies and their own needs as well, because they're expected to model these skills and strategies to their students, and they have a difficult time doing so if they're not there. And so more and more we're seeing social emotional learning efforts be directed towards teachers, in part by facilitating relationships and collaborations for teachers to support effective implementation of both social emotional learning and academic content. And last but not least, I wanted to describe student voice initiatives, which is a relatively new focus for many schools. And these are important because they serve an important role in the continuous improvement of social emotional learning efforts. They also require social and emotional competence, so that it gives students the opportunity to develop competence in this area, and to support a safe and caring learning environment. So student voice initiatives consider students as partners in the education institutions. It can be done through student ambassadors or advisory boards, but there are 5 key elements to student voice initiatives. 1 is that the topic has to be relevant to students. 2 is that the conversations with adults needs to be ongoing. It's not just a check-in for feedback and to check the box off, but they have to be a part of this process. They are involved in the planning and decision-making efforts of their schools and their systems, and the power between students and adults is shared. And they're also involved in the school improvement efforts. And so this is an important component of social emotional learning as well. And it's relatively novel and I would argue very interesting. So I will leave you with student voice and open it up for questions.
Okay, so while we are waiting for some questions to come through, I'm going to push out our stakeholder feedback survey link. We would like to ask you to complete this to let us know how we did today, what you might like to see done differently, what you liked. If you need more information, for example, it only takes a few minutes, and it's a really important part of how we plan for additional webinars and how we hopefully continue to get better. So if you can click on that link that's just right there and fill that out, we would appreciate that very much. And while you are doing that, we do have some other questions. So here's one. Do you ever get pushback from parents when there is an SEL program in place? And if you do, how do you recommend the teacher or school have that?
So
handle that, I'm sorry.
Yeah. That is a good question. Depending on how social emotional learning is communicated, it could result in some pushback from parents. It's important to communicate very early on the goal and purpose of a social emotional learning initiative. In my experience, I've often used student data to start the conversation, but typically what can happen is, not always, but I've seen examples of social emotional learning initiatives becoming political, or parents misinterpreting what the intention is. So, you don't want to teach your student emotions, or as a comment that I've seen. And sometimes what all educators need to do is just reframe the initiative to be something that is maybe more palatable for some parents if there's a large enough pushback. So that's a possibility, and I would argue that the best approach is just to be open throughout the entire process, from when you're thinking about social emotional learning and strategies to when you're implementing it, and to show them that there is a need there, and that you are having an impact by helping students. Oftentimes too, as parents start to buy into the initiatives when they see the changes in their students. I've heard stories of parents saying that their kid is talking to them differently, and that their relationship has changed because they're able to communicate better with one another, or just things like that too.
So it looks like we have another question. Is the student voice for K through 12 levels?
You know, I know that in my own experiences, I've seen student voice from like maybe late elementary school to 12th, up to 12th grade, with the engagement being a little bit more sophisticated as students get older. I haven't seen it yet in very young grades, but I can check my sources, because when students get really young, a lot of times what I see is that they're not really sure what we're looking for. They're thinking that maybe that they're being tested, or that we're looking for a certain answer, and they don't really understand the purpose. But I have been, for example, in Hawaii, I was in a summit with some young students who gave some really good and insightful feedback on some of the initiatives going on in Hawaii as well. And yeah.
I was just going to jump in on there's a follow-up question on whether there's pushback from teachers with the new SEL programs.
Definitely, and that does mirror some of the parents' concerns, but also we see pushback from teachers when, again, this is why communication is key, is we get pushback from teachers who think that they have to do just another thing, just another program. And part of the benefit of the academic integration piece is that you can tell teachers that the school is just saying that you do what you've already been doing. You've already been supporting students' social emotional needs in your classrooms. We're just going to give you additional support to do so. So yes, there definitely can be pushback from teachers as well, is a short answer, but there are strategies that districts have used to address that.
And we have a comment from Kenwin that the term social emotional can scare people off, and that she's heard concerns about it veering into the mental health arena or getting too personal. But when it's more specifically described in terms like communication skills, planning, self-management techniques, teamwork, critical thinking, etc., you can get more buy-in, and that people often can see the benefits for relationships, academics, and workplace success when it's described like that.
Definitely. And the terms social and emotional are these very broad terms that encompass a lot of these things. So it can, I can see, it does sound that way, and that might be a part of the reframing that a district may want to engage in, even though they might be adopting a framework that says social emotional learning, but then they want to describe their efforts around building communication skills and getting students ready for the workforce or what have you, depending on the goal.
Okay, so we're going to leave this open for just another moment. I'm going to push that survey link out one more time if you haven't had a chance to click on that. I will send that out in a follow-up email probably tomorrow also. We really do appreciate you filling that out. From Roberta, thank you for including opportunities for reflection and questions during the presentation. Thank you, Roberta. It's always nice to hear your thoughts and your questions. We really appreciate it. And for everyone who chimed in and who offered their perspective, we do very much appreciate that.
Yes, thank you, Roberta.
So I'll leave that link up for just another moment, and we will give it just another moment for any other questions. But I think it seems like we are wrapping up here. Giving you a little bit of found time on a Monday, get a little time back in your day. We very much appreciate you joining us, as always, for this REL Pacific webinar. We know you all have a lot on your plate, and so we very much appreciate you spending some of that time with us today.